The morning sun broke gently across the high ridges of the valley, casting a golden hue over the frostbitten earth. The wind stirred the brittle grass and whispered through the bones of an old, worn-down barn that stood like a memory at the edge of the hill. Inside that barn, nestled in a modest wooden stall, was a dapple-gray gelding named Jasper. He stirred as the familiar crunch of boots approached. Each footstep came slow and deliberate, as if the earth itself waited for them to land. The door creaked open, and Silas stepped through, clutching a tin bucket in one hand, a woolen scarf loosely coiled around his neck. He wasn't much to look at, stooped with age, his beard more silver than white, his coat threadbare and patched more times than he could count. But in his quiet gaze lived years of loss, grit, and something else too, a stubborn spark that hadn't yet dimmed. "Morning, old boy," he murmured, his voice a hoarse melody of gravel and kindness. Jasper nickered softly and shuffled forward, his large eyes locking with Silas's as if the two were finishing a conversation that never needed words. Silas set the bucket down and reached out a hand, his fingers gnarled and calloused, yet gentle as they brushed the horse's muzzle. For as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember, it had just been the two of them, Silas and Jasper. People said Silas used to be something once, a rancher, maybe even a rodeo man. There were whispers of medals tucked away in old trunks, of a wife who once laughed like wind chimes, of a son who never came back from the war. But that was all speculation now. Truth had faded with time, and the only thing that remained was the undeniable, unshakable bond between the man and his horse. Each day passed like the last. Silas would tend to the fields as best he could. What little of them hadn't been swallowed by drought or neglect. Jasper would follow him, never tethered, never commanded. Where Silas went, Jasper went too. In town, they were a curiosity, an image from another life. Kids would stare. Grown men would nod respectfully, unsure whether they were acknowledging Silas or the life he represented. And Silas, he just kept walking, never asking, never needing anything more than what he already had. That winter had arrived early, colder, meaner. The woodpile was shrinking faster than it should, and Silas's cough had returned, deeper now. He ignored it, always had. His concern was for Jasper, who had begun showing signs of wear himself, slower to rise, more hesitant on his feet, and a strange trembling that came and went without reason. Silas noticed, of course. He always noticed. "You're just feeling the cold, same as me," he whispered one evening, rubbing the gelding's flank. "We'll get through it. We always do." But even as he said it, he knew something wasn't right. Jasper's coat had lost its shine. His appetite dulled. The usual mischief in his eyes had dimmed to a dull glow, like the last ember of a dying fire. The nights grew longer, and the wind howled louder. Silas found himself talking more. To Jasper, to himself, to the shadows that gathered in the corners of the barn. Memories crept in like unwelcome guests. The sound of boots on porch steps, the echo of laughter in a kitchen long since quiet, the weight of a folded flag pressed into trembling hands. Sometimes he could swear Jasper was listening, not just hearing, but understanding, bearing the weight of that pain with him, step for step. Then, one morning, Silas found him lying down and not getting back up. His heart dropped. "Jasper," he said, panic strangling his voice as he knelt beside the horse. "Come on now, none of that. Not today." The gelding didn't move, save for a slow, labored breath and the faintest twitch of an ear. His eyes opened, unfocused. Silas stayed beside him the whole day, tried coaxing him up with treats, with whispered encouragement, even with desperate prayers muttered under his breath. But Jasper remained down, his strength clearly drained by something deeper than just age or cold. That night, Silas didn't return to the house. He lay next to Jasper, wrapped in an old blanket, feeding him water by the spoonful, brushing his mane with trembling fingers. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft at first, then thick and relentless, blanketing the world in silence. By morning, the storm had trapped them in. No phone, no help, no way to get to town. Silas knew then, as he sat beside his ailing friend, that this was something he could not fix alone. He stared at Jasper, who looked back at him with tired eyes, and felt something deep within him begin to crack. Not a sharp break, but a slow, creeping fracture, like ice splitting across a pond. "I can't lose you, too," he whispered. "Not you." He didn't cry. Silas never cried, but his voice trembled in a way it hadn't in years. The man who had once faced down stampedes, thunderheads, and the aching loneliness of loss, now sat helpless beside the only soul left who knew the full story of who he was. Sometime in the afternoon, after forcing down a stale biscuit and half a cup of bitter coffee, Silas did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for help. Bundled in layers, scarf pulled tight around his face, he trudged out into the snowstorm. The cold stabbed through him like needles. The wind howled like wolves. But he kept going, one painful step after another. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. The town nearly 12. But he didn't care. If he could just get someone to help, a vet, a trailer, medicine, anything. He had to try. Behind him, the barn grew smaller, swallowed by snowfall. Inside it, Jasper lay waiting, the last thread binding Silas to this world of memories and second chances. And though the wind tried to push him back, though his legs begged to stop, Silas pressed on. He had once ridden across open plains with nothing but a saddle and sky. He had once held his son above his head and spun him until laughter echoed through the valley. He had once stared down death and spat in its eye. He wasn't about to give up now. Not while Jasper still breathed. By the time he reached the edge of the road, his knees buckled. He collapsed beside a half-buried fence post, breath ragged, lungs burning. The world tilted and blurred. Snow clung to his lashes, his coat, his beard. He reached for something, anything, but the cold offered no comfort. Then, through the veil of white, came a sound. Tires crunching. A horn. Headlights cutting through the fog of snow like divine intervention. A truck pulled to a stop. A door flung open. "Silas," a voice called out. "My God, what are you doing out here?" He tried to answer, but his voice was gone. Strong arms hoisted him up. The door slammed. Heat blasted his frozen skin. And then came the words, urgent and filled with concern. "Hang on. We're getting you home." But home wasn't the house. Home was the barn, where Jasper lay waiting. And as Silas drifted into unconsciousness, one thought clung to him like a final promise. He wasn't done fighting yet. Silas awoke to warmth. Not the kind that came from blankets or the weak stove in his kitchen, but the kind that wrapped around you and held tight. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the quiet shuffle of footsteps told him this wasn't home. His eyes opened slowly. White ceiling, pale green walls, and 4 in his arm. He turned his head, grimacing against the pull in his muscles. A nurse noticed the movement and walked over briskly. "Well, it's about time," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You scared everyone half to death." He tried to speak, but only a wheeze came out. She handed him a small cup of iced chips, and he nodded gratefully, letting them melt on his tongue. "Where?" he managed, barely a whisper. "My horse." The nurse's expression softened. She glanced toward the hallway before answering. "They brought him in too. Or rather, your neighbor did. The young man with the flatbed truck. They had to pull the gate off your barn to get him out. He's in a stable at the vet clinic down the road. Weak but alive." Relief flooded him, hot and overwhelming. Jasper was still alive. That was all that mattered. The nurse smiled faintly. "You'll need to rest for a day or 2 before they let you out. Doctor's orders." Silas nodded, but he was already thinking ahead. He wouldn't stay longer than necessary. Jasper needed him, and every minute away felt like an eternity. The next day, he signed his discharge papers with a shaky hand, borrowed a coat someone had left folded on a chair, and insisted on walking down to the vet clinic himself. A younger man, Charlie, the neighbor who'd picked him up, offered to drive, but Silas declined. He needed the time, needed the cold air in his lungs, needed the pain in his joints to remind him he was still here and still fighting. The clinic stood quietly at the edge of town, surrounded by fenced paddocks and a few low, heated barns. A kind-faced vet named Dr. Evelyn Hughes met him at the gate. "I was hoping you'd come today," she said, walking with him toward one of the side stalls. He's stable, but it was close. Malnutrition, dehydration, infection, we're treating it all. He's strong, though. Tougher than he looks. So's his owner, Silas replied quietly. She smiled, then paused before opening the stall door. He's been restless since you left. I think he's been waiting. Inside, Jasper lay on a bed of straw, his sides rising and falling slowly, eyes half closed. But the moment Silas stepped in, those eyes snapped open. The gelding gave a low, trembling nicker. Silas crossed the distance in 3 steps, dropping to his knees beside him, his hand finding Jasper's neck with instinctive grace. The horse leaned into his touch like it was water in a drought. "I'm here," Silas murmured, his voice breaking for the first time. "I'm here, boy." They stayed like that for a long while. No words, just presence. Jasper's breathing steadied, and Silas could feel a pulse of hope thudding under his palm. For the first time in days, maybe longer, something inside him unodded. Dr. Hughes stood quietly in the doorway. "He's got a chance, Silas. But it's going to be a fight. He'll need care, medicine, food, attention, and time." Silas looked up. "I'll do whatever it takes." She nodded. "Then let's get to work." And so began a new rhythm, different than the one they had known, but sacred just the same. Every day, Silas walked a mile from his house to the clinic. Sometimes Charlie drove him. Sometimes he walked with a cane he refused to admit he needed. Each visit was marked by Jasper's ears perking up, his tail twitching faintly, the light returning by inches to his eyes. Silas cleaned out his stall, helped feed him, whispered stories from years long past, about rodeos, wild mustangs, dusty plains, and campfires under open skies. He didn't know if Jasper understood the words, but he understood the tone, the love behind them. The townsfolk began to take notice. Word spread quietly, as things always did in places like theirs. First it was the feed store that offered supplies on credit. Then a group of children brought carrots, awkwardly thrust through the stall bars with giggles. A retired farrier stopped by one morning to help trim Jasper's hooves free of charge. Even the sheriff dropped in, bringing a bale of alfalfa and pretending it was surplus. Silas was too proud to ask for help, but the town had decided it was time to give it anyway. One snowy afternoon, Silas sat beside Jasper, brushing him gently while the gelding dozed. Charlie leaned against the stall rail. "You know," he said, "I never really understood it before. You and him. I used to think it was just habit. A man and his horse, stuck in their ways." Silas didn't look up. "And now?" Charlie shrugged. "Now I think it's the most loyal friendship I've ever seen." Silas chuckled softly. "That's not friendship. That's family." There was a pause before Charlie spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why him? I mean, of all the horses in the world, what made you choose him?" Silas stopped brushing. He stared ahead, lost in the dust motes swirling in the sunbeam. "He didn't have anyone," he said after a long silence. "Just like me. When I first saw him, he was half-starved, all bone and wild eyes. People said he was no good, dangerous, but he looked at me like he knew exactly what that felt like, and I knew I'd found the last piece I needed to keep going." Charlie didn't respond. There wasn't much to say after something like that. Weeks passed. Jasper began standing more often, moving a little steadier. His coat started to regain its sheen. The vet was cautiously optimistic, though she warned Silas that some damage might be permanent. "He may never be the same," she said gently. "You'll have to prepare for that." Silas nodded, his eyes never leaving Jasper. "He doesn't have to be the same. He just has to be here." Then came a morning when Silas entered the stall and found Jasper already on his feet, ears forward, eyes bright. He stepped toward him, not shuffling, not stumbling, but steady, deliberate. It felt like a miracle. Silas pressed his forehead to Jasper's, eyes squeezed shut. "You did it," he whispered. "You stubborn, beautiful fool. You did it." That day, the town gathered outside the clinic. No announcement, no flyers, just a quiet understanding. People brought blankets, apples, handwritten notes. One woman played a slow tune on an old harmonica. Children clapped when Jasper took a few steps outside, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, guided gently by Silas's hand. Dr. Hughes stood beside Charlie, both watching the scene unfold. "It's more than a recovery," she said. "It's a resurrection." Charlie nodded. "It's hope. That's what they're seeing." Later that night, Silas and Jasper stood beneath the stars. The air was cold, but not cruel. Silas looked up at the sky, then down at his companion. "You remember that summer storm? The one that nearly swept us off the ridge? You held your ground. I held mine. That's all we've ever done, isn't it? Hold the line." Jasper flicked an ear. "We're not done yet," Silas said softly. "There's more road ahead." And though the night stretched long and silent, something in the air felt different, like a chapter had ended, not in grief, but in quiet triumph. Like life, even after breaking you down, could still hand you back a piece of what you'd lost. They turned toward the path home, side by side, each step a promise. The snow melted slow that year, as if the land itself was reluctant to let go of the stillness. Mud lined the trails in deep brown ruts, and the creek behind Silas's house, once a narrow trickle, now rushed with a thaw. Jasper stood stronger with each sunrise, his gait no longer tentative but deliberate, like a creature rediscovering the rhythm of its bones. They had returned to the cabin a week ago. Dr. Hughes had hesitated, but when Jasper paced his stall with a restlessness she recognized as longing, she gave her cautious blessing. "Bring him back home," she said. "Let him smell the pines again." And so they had. Charlie helped reinforce the barn doors, and the neighbors left hay bales stacked higher than ever before. The town, once watchful from a distance, now leaned in with a sense of stewardship, as if Jasper belonged to them too. Silas spent his days tending the land, brushing the winter weariness off every fence post, every gate hinge, every memory still tethered to that soil. Jasper followed him, a quiet sentinel, never far behind. Sometimes, in the golden hush before sunset, Silas would sit on the porch and speak aloud, not because he expected a reply, but because that's what you did when someone had been beside you longer than silence itself. "You remember that old trail beyond the ridge?" he said one evening, eyes on the horizon. "Used to ride it when I needed to think. I reckon I haven't seen that view in years." Jasper, ears twitching, gave a faint nicker, as if he remembered too. It took them nearly 2 hours the next morning, but they made it. Silas walked, cane in one hand, reins in the other, pausing often but refusing help. The wind met them on the ridge like an old friend, sharp, clean, familiar. The valley sprawled below, untouched and wide as memory. For a long time, neither moved. Then, with a deep breath, Silas pulled a small leather pouch from his coat. He loosened the drawstring and let the ashes inside scatter into the wind. "I promised I'd bring her back here," he whispered. "Took me a while." Jasper lowered his head, resting his muzzle against Silas's arm. The old man closed his eyes. "I think she would have liked you." The days that followed were slower, not because of sickness or age, but because Silas no longer rushed. There was a gentleness to his movements now, a quiet reverence, as though each action held the weight of something sacred. He wrote letters, some he mailed, some he burned. He tended his tools, replaced the barn roof with Charlie's help, and even patched the saddle that hadn't been touched in over a decade. People still came by, less frequently, but more personally. A young girl named Lydia, who had brought carrots during Jasper's recovery, now visited every Friday after school. She would sit cross-legged in the straw while Jasper stood over her like a watchful guardian. Sometimes she read aloud. Sometimes she just talked. "He listens better than most people," she said one afternoon, scratching behind Jasper's ear. Silas smiled from the doorway. "That's because he doesn't interrupt." One morning, the air changed. Silas couldn't explain it, couldn't point to anything different. But as he stepped outside, coffee in hand, he felt it in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the silence between birdsong. Jasper stood at the edge of the paddock, still as stone, facing the hills. Silas approached slowly, his breath fogging in the chill. "What is it, boy?" Jasper didn't move. His ears flicked, but his body remained locked, tense. Then Silas saw it. Far off, near the tree line, something stirred. A shape, Too tall for a deer, too lean for a bear. A horse. No, 3 horses. Mustangs. They stepped from the shadows like ghosts, manes tangled, flanks ribbed, eyes bright with wildness. Jasper's head lifted, nostrils flaring. Silas felt something shift deep inside his chest. "They came for you," he said softly. The Mustangs didn't move closer. They stood watching, poised between caution and curiosity. Jasper took a step forward. Silas's grip on the reins tightened involuntarily. He hadn't used them in weeks, but the feel of leather was instinct. Jasper paused, waiting. Silas looked at the gelding, really looked. The coat had regained its coppery shine. The scar on his left flank, once angry and inflamed, was now a pale memory. His legs were firm, his eyes clear. "You're not mine anymore, are you?" Silas asked. Jasper turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of the words. "I kept you alive, but you kept me going." Another step forward. Silas reached out, fingers brushing the warm side of Jasper's neck. The contact was electric, final. He let the reins slide through his hand and fall to the dirt. "If you have another ride left in you," he said, voice thick, "go." Jasper moved slowly at first, then broke into a canter, hooves tearing through the thawing field. The Mustangs waited, silent, steady, until he reached them. There was no greeting, no ceremony. He simply fell into stride beside them, and the 3 turned as one, disappearing into the trees. Silas stood alone, cane planted in the soil, eyes fixed on the fading shape of his only companion. He didn't cry. Not then. Not that day. But the next morning, when he went to the barn and saw the empty stall, the untouched water, the silence, where once there was breath, that's when it hit. He sat on the straw-covered floor and let it all come. The grief, the pride, the hollow ache, and the strange, blooming peace. Charlie came by later, finding him still there. "He's gone?" he asked. Silas nodded. Charlie knelt beside him. "You okay?" Silas gave a tired chuckle. "No, but I will be." In the days that followed, the town spoke of it like legend. Some said the Mustangs had been a sign. Others said Jasper had always belonged to the wild, that Silas had only borrowed him for a while. No one dared to question what it had meant. Lydia still came by, though now she brought drawings, sketches of Jasper, of the ridge, of wild horses under full moons. Silas pinned them to the walls of the barn, one by one. Spring bled into summer. The land warmed. The fields greened. Silas moved slower now, but not out of sorrow, out of intention. He planted a tree near the barn, a young oak, and carved Jasper's name into a stone he placed at its base. One morning, as the sun pushed through the clouds in golden sheets, a shadow passed across the porch. Silas looked up, heart pausing. There, on the hilltop, stood a single horse. Not Jasper. Younger. Wary. Alone. Silas didn't move. He didn't call out. He simply waited. The horse took a step forward, then another. Behind him, the door creaked open. Lydia stepped out, eyes wide. "Is that?" Silas shook his head slowly. "No, but maybe." The horse reached the fence line and stopped. Silas rose, every bone complaining, and walked to the gate. "Looks like you've got nowhere to go," he murmured. The horse sniffed the air. His sides were lean, his coat dull. A survivor. Silas opened the gate, then stepped back. The horse hesitated only a moment before walking through. Lydia came to stand beside him. "You're going to keep him?" Silas watched as the horse lowered his head to graze, his body no longer rigid with fear. "I think," Silas said, voice soft, "he kept me." And as the breeze rustled the trees and the oak sapling danced in the wind, Silas felt it. Not the absence of what was lost, but the quiet arrival of something new. Not a replacement, not a second chance, just a continuation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, worn sugar cube. "Welcome home, son," he said, holding it out.